Hi, I'm Christian Foley. I'm a spoken word educator and a hip hop MC. I work primarily in East London, in the community of Hackney, helping children to express themselves through poetry and to give them some kind of voice and empowerment. Now, today we're going to be talking about poetry in a sense of not why to write it, but how to write it. And not that there is an answer for that, but this is my personal opinion of how I go about teaching and facilitating poetry workshops. Now, of course, bear in mind this will be different for every single poet on earth. Now, I want to start with a little story. I used to live in Chile in South America, and I was told a story again and again about their national symbol for poetry. Now, this is a man called Pablo Neruda, one of the most beautiful poets through language that has ever lived. And Chile and Chileans, they're very proud of Pablo. So they would tell me this story, and they would refer to 1948. Now, at this point in time, the Chilean president was a guy called Videla, and he was rigorously right-wing. Pablo Neruda was an activist for communism. He was very left-wing. He would criticize governments, and he was at the forefront of protest, and he wanted social change. Naturally, Videla did not want this. He ordered the arrest of Pablo Neruda, the poet. Again, a symbol of the power of poetry. It has to be suppressed in some people's views. So Pablo is doing a performance, and it's a packed auditorium. He knows there's a warrant for his arrest. He knows this might be one of his last performances. He chooses to stand there, shuffle his papers and say, I'm going to do a protest set. I'm going to do a protest set about the injustice of my own situation. Halfway through his set, as he's performing these pro-left-wing poetry, Videla walks in, the president, and Pablo Neruda sees the president walk in, flanked by an armed guard, men with guns. Now it's quite clear what's about to happen at this point. Pablo Neruda has very few options left. He shuffles his papers again. He starts reading love poetry. He chooses to read his most beautiful, his most poignant poems on the subject of love. Videla sits down on the front row and starts watching him like a hawk, with his arms folded. He watches him the whole time. Now, Pablo Neruda does not know how his poetry is being received. He does not know whether he's going to live out the night. Now, about 3/4 of the way through his performance of love poems, he looked closely at Videla, and he started to notice something. And despite the blank expression of the president, he noticed a single tear falling down the cheeks. The guy had been moved to tears by Pablo Neruda, and Pablo Neruda, through his words, had saved his life. The president, still with arms folded, got up and left the room. Now later, as the story goes, that if at any point during the performance Videla had uncrossed his arms, Pablo Neruda would have been shot dead. The signal was to be the dropping of the arm. So it brings up the discussion that Neruda saved his own life with poetry, and how do we do that? How do we write poetry so poignant, powerful, and moving that it has the ability to save your life, that it has the ability to preserve your entire existence? Now, first off, I want to talk about my poetry is in terms of my career. I've been writing poetry since the age of 10. I think I was first published about 11 years old. Not that publishing is a hallmark of quality, of course, so that's by the by. But I now have a career that didn't exist 2 years ago. I'm what's called a spoken word educator, and this is a brand new career. 2 years ago, there was no such thing. And this was the vision of a man called Peter Kahn. Peter was a social worker in Chicago, and he used creative writing in a therapeutic sense, and he saw the power of it. Now, he had this dream, and he had a dream that when his nephew, who 2 years ago was 6 years old and is now 8, when his nephew grows up, there will be a poet embedded in every school in the United States. He wanted a further vision than that. He came to the UK, and using connections he met in Chicago, he set it up. He set the first spoken word education program that the world has ever seen. And this was a revolutionary idea. A lot of people were opposed to it, didn't see the point or the purpose of it. But he set it up, and it came into existence, and now it starts to come into fruition. So, my job as a spoken word educator is unlocking the stories that are held within our students. how does a spoken word educator go about this? It's quite the task. So I want to talk about my teaching practice. All spoken word educators, we have what's probably quite a clunky phrase, but it refers to what we do. And it's called an overarching pedagogical metaphor. Essentially, that is fancy speak for the way that we as individuals approach our own teaching. So my own teaching is linked to my own writing style. I'm a hip-hop artist, so I inflect my poetry with dense rhythms, dense sounds, a lot of multisyllabic rhymes. For example, I'm going to read you an excerpt of a poem. I have two things that affect my teaching practice. The first is hip-hop. Fishing in seas, so cold that your fingers would freeze in the hiss of the whistling breeze, with the grass rich in green and the sky was dipped in the sheen of bright blue. I try to live in this dream, but all I see is clinically clean drips and beakers, uniforms and nervous speakers. So I close my eyes and I close my ears. I see you on a beach with old jeans rolled to the knees. Warm water flows over your feet, over the warm golden soul, then goes in retreat, combing the driftwood and white sand. Your slight hand waves like the ocean, eyes bright with quiet devotion. So that is an example of the way that I would structure a poem. It's dense with rhymes, it's dense with rhythm, and it's very influenced by hip-hop. Now, as you may have gleaned from the poem, it's all about the ocean. The ocean is the next thing that really influences the way that I work. Now, I grew up for part of my life on the beach, on a house by the sea, watching the sea every day. And something about the water really affected the way that I write. You know, water is the source of our life. We know very little about it, but it covers our, 2/3 of our planet. Its depths are unexplored, and its power and its beauty are beyond measure. So really, in terms of poetry, I wanted to explore that. I wanted to think, how can I explore this idea of the sea and relate it to what I do? So hip-hop and the ocean make up my writing and my teaching practice. So my personal metaphor is something that I used to do, and this is freediving. So for those that don't know what freediving is the art of underwater exploration that relies on nothing but bravery and breath. You don't have a scuba tank, you don't have any reserves, okay? You only have your own lungs. Now, I use this as a metaphor for the way that we write poetry. And I'm going to break this down into steps for you. So the first step I would do is talk about freediving. And I would ask a student, have I gone mad? Why have I come into your lesson and started speaking about freediving? It has nothing to do with poetry. Or does it? How can we relate the two? In the words of Whitney from year 9, she says, poetry writing is like freediving because it is scary. You have a big space to explore and you can go deeper and deeper. You don't know what you will find. Now, as Whitney identified, I teach you the principles of exploring the unexplored and going deep. There's a man called Jeff Katz, and he published a book all about how poetry writing is linked to archaeology and digging. Now, I take those ideas, but I build on them in a different sense, and I relate it to the ocean rather than the earth. So when I talk about going deep, I ask the students what this means. What does it mean to go deep? And first off, we talk about internal depth, the idea to look within yourself and go deeper and deeper into your memories, into your experiences, into your identity. And then I would say, great. It's great to go internally deep. Is there another depth we can hit? I'm thinking of the opposite. What is external depth? So external depth is the ability to then look at your environment. As a free diver would, as he's diving and he's searching, he would look around, or she would look around and find something that they'd never seen before, something of beauty. Now this is external depth, and a student has to look at the world in that way. And then I ask the students, what's better? Is it better to dive internally into yourself? Is it better to dive externally? Now they always try to choose one or the other because unfortunately our students, before they come to us, are programmed to think in binary terms of right and wrong. So they'll say, oh, it's internal, or no, it's external. In reality, it is both. So the most valuable poetry, I say to the students, is not poetry that just has internal depth or poetry that derives from external depth. It is a combination of the both. It is the ability to look at the world, look at the external and process it, to look deeper, to see every detail. But it is also the ability to look deep within yourself, within your life experiences, your community, your memories, and everything that makes up the fabric of you. Only when you can combine those two, the internal and the external, then that is emotional literacy. And that is the kind of poetry that we as a movement are trying to promote. I'm going to break this down into the exact lesson planning that we would do for it could be over a year of workshops, it could be in just one lesson, but these are the steps. So the first step is lungs. So before a diver can approach the water, they must build up their lungs. Now in the same way, poetry is a process. You can't just dive into a poem and produce a product spontaneously. You have to exercise your mind in the same way that a diver has to build up their breathing capacity. So this is the lungs. Step 2, familiarization. Going deep. As a freediver builds up their lungs, has built up their tolerance and their familiarity with the water, only then can they begin to go deep. Now water is an interesting one because many of our students in landlocked Hackney, they've never been to the sea, they've never swam in the sea, and it is a scary thought to them. Similarly, they've never written a poem. And the same vast expanse of water that covers our planet, that might as well be poetry to them because it is equally as frightening and as enthralling and tempting to engage with. But the first step is to get used to it, to familiarize yourself, to listen to poetry, to read poetry, to get used to being around it. So this is step 2, in the same way that a freediver will familiarize themselves on the surface of their dive before they begin to go deep. This is step 3, going deep. As the freediver has built their lungs and becomes more accustomed to the ocean, they can begin to go deeper and deeper, exploring the unknown. There is no limit to how deep a diver can go throughout their life. Journey by journey, there is an infinite space to explore. Similarly, it's the same for a poet. A poet has no limit on how deep you choose to go. Once you start analyzing yourself and your surroundings, there's no end. There is an infinite space to explore, just as there is in the ocean. Now, step 4 is retrieving the value of a poem. As a diver will sometimes hit the seabed and find a pearl or a conch and bring it back to the surface, a poet does the same. So I often tell the kids about a certain scenario when freediving was first kind of invented as a practice, and this was in Crete by the ancient Greeks. Now they would go down and dive for pearls and conches, and they could only do this by diving in these underwater tunnels. And there became a philosophy where at some point a freediver would be at the edge of their breath. They would just be about to essentially suffocate and die. Now these divers that with bursting lungs chose to swim on in that dark tunnel, they chose to hope that there would be an exit. Their act of faith is comparable to the act of faith and hope and bravery that is required for a student who has never written poetry to sit and write and perform poetry. And we have to combat that fear and take that step while also, acknowledging that this is a hard step to take. And many people will be uncomfortable with it. So that is step 4, is getting that value. And to get the value, to get that pearl, to get that shell from the floor, to get that experience from the poem, you have to invest something. You have to invest the sense of bravery. Number 5 is performance. So as a conch, it's an object that when you, it's from the sea, but when you blow it, it creates a musical instrument. And I use that as the metaphor for after we go through this dive and we've got our words on the page, how are we going to then translate that into sound? And then we will do performance workshops working on the delivery of a poem, how it sounds, how can we translate what we've got on the page to the wider world. And this is the thing with spoken word. There is a misconception that spoken word artists can't hold their own on the page, or somehow that being a performance poet implies that your performance is there to compensate for a less strong appearance on the page. This is not so. And our children are encouraged that your work on the page is equally as important as your work orally. So performance and writing, they are two sides of the same coin. The last stage, stage 6 rather, is reflection. So having returned from your dive, a diver will reflect. They will see their appearance in the waves, in the water, and they will process how they have been changed by going under, by going deep. In the same way, after a poet finishes their experience, and it's an experience, it's not about producing a poem, it's about undergoing an experience. Now following this, there has to be some sense of reflection, a sense of looking at yourself and thinking, what's changed? How have I changed since I walked in this room? And when I walk out, what are the fundamental differences, however minute they might be, to my character? Now if we magnify this after time and time again, then we get self-development. And with self-development, we become better humans naturally. So this process is a form of therapy, in a sense. So I get people coming up to me after performances sometimes, and they say things like, poetry is so in right now. You know, it's great. I'm here because I just feel that poetry is in. This is quite a dangerous opinion to have. I think that poetry is not something that can be in or out. I would prefer to view it as time. It is a constant. It is something that we shouldn't view as fashionable, because if something is fashionable, it can also become unfashionable. And I think that poetry, we have to get away from these marketing terms. I mean, spoken word, by all accounts, as a term, is a marketing term. I market myself as a spoken word artist because people identify with that, and they think, okay, this is revolutionary, this is new, but essentially I'm a poet, and we are all poets, and the dichotomy shouldn't exist, but arguably it has to, so that we can differentiate ourselves from William Blake or Shakespeare, for example. So I really want to get across the idea that longevity is key. These poets, they achieve longevity not by writing at the time, and you know, Shakespeare wasn't sitting down thinking, yeah, this is gonna hit the market. This is gonna be really trendy for the next 2 weeks. This is gonna be a hit. Derek Walcott, when he wrote Omeros, one of my favorite books, he wasn't thinking, yeah, I really need to remix the Iliad, and I need to tap into some old world stories and revamp them and sell them because that's what the trend is now. No, almost inevitably you have to go against the trend. So I think that longevity is key in poetry. Now, I could write 1 million iambic pentameter sonnets and I still couldn't stress that idea enough. What I would say is that when you write, it has to be for longevity, and it has to be something that you can look back on in 15 years, in 30 years, and think, this was an accurate representation of where I was at the time. And it has to be you. You don't, you can channel other voices, you can have influences, you can have inspirations, but it has to be you. You have to imbue your own sense of self into your work. And if you do that, your work will persist. And whether I can do that and whether I will be successful in that, who knows? In 3 centuries' time, who knows? I doubt it, but it's my struggle, and it is the struggle of every poet, is to have enough of our sense of self that it pervades and it persists. And that is the challenge. So Pablo Neruda, he saved his life with his verse. So at the end of his lines, he made sure that he hadn't reached the end of his line, and he succeeded. And he did that because poetry is a nutrition for the soul, essentially. In a society where we are so starved of creativity, poetry is a nutrition for your soul. It's not about great writing. It's about the greatness of writing as a process, how great it is that we are able to write. It is not about good poetry. It is about the good of poetry. And once we recognize this, then we can strive for the longevity that allows our work and our art to persist and to sustain itself. And this is the challenge. So go ahead, dive in. Thank you. So students, I'm going to assume that you've never been diving. We're going to have a little dive now. What I want you to do, and I know this might look like yoga or meditation, in a sense it is, but it's also poetry writing. I want you to take your 2 forefingers and press them on your eardrums, at the same time closing your eyes. Do this for 5 minutes, but for the sake of the video, it's going to be 5 seconds. Now, what should happen in this process is it will sound like you are underwater. And when you are underwater, the sounds of your body become accentuated. The sounds of the outside world become muted. This is conducive to poetry writing because you have to be attuned to what is going on with you. What is going on outside of you at that specific moment is irrelevant because you start off with your internal depth and you are thinking about your body and your mind. Now, once you are in that state, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to write this down. So I'm going to ask you, what is one thing that no one knows about you? Take 2 minutes to write this down. Once this is written down, we're going to go deeper still. I want you to imagine that everyone finds out this one thing. How does your life change? I want you to write from a future perspective where your secret has been unearthed. What's different now about your present life? I want you to go deeper and deeper still. I want you to write from that perspective. I want you to imagine your future self. And it's a future self whereby everything has changed and you're channeling that voice. And once you've done that, after 5 minutes or so, I want you to start coming back to the surface. Break free from your writing. Look at it. Reflect. What have you just produced? And how have you done it? Congratulations on your first dive. My name's Christian Foley, and this poem is called Maths 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Why 2, 3, 4? Why do we study maths, sir? He knew too much of division. Now he saw division as two figures, either side of a table in prison, plus equals. Equals equaled a letterbox, beneath which his dad's letters wrought. Why do we study maths, sir? He found few pluses to addition. Plus, he recognized plus from the collision when the ambulance screamed that day to carry his brother away. Why do we study maths, sir? He too knew much of subtraction. Subtraction, that was a knife-nick scar, while fractions were split families or crossed hearts or whole bodies cut in half. Why do we study maths, sir? It is for multiplication, please. Take this as a sign that I need you to see, to reread and break all of your brackets free. You are 99 times the boy the world says you will be.